Yeah, I'll
Okay.
go. Hi guys, we did our cultural plunge over the Brazos Valley African American Museum.
This is a
And
picture of the front.
yeah, this is what it looks like. So our expectations before going into this museum was before visiting the Brazos Valley African American Museum, we hoped to understand African American culture and history better. We thought it would be an opportunity to see exhibits that depict the struggles and triumphs of the African American community and possibly be able to gain a better understanding of the harsh realities of slavery and segregation through firsthand accounts and historical documents. And these are a few pictures that we took as we walked throughout the exam of their exhibits. And so, how the museum started, when we were talking to one of the employees, they said that a former educator realized African American stories weren't being told in this area, so she started collecting everything she could to start the museum. And today it's here to tell the stories. People coming in get excited to see and hear their stories, and sometimes people come in and see their names of family members.
So now we're going to show a timeline of the African American history. This is some of the stuff that was included in the museum. So the first thing that was included was the Underground Railroad. And some specifics about this is the Underground Railroad came about, it came about because they essentially would disappear into the ground. So it wasn't necessarily underground, but they would just disappear. And they used these to escape to freedom from slavery. And then Harriet Tubman was a well-known abolitionist associated with the Underground Railroad, and she actually helped over 70 people escape from slavery, and it is estimated that over 100,000 people escaped from slavery using the Underground Railroad.
Okay, so next in 1869, the 15th Amendment was passed on February 26th. It gave Black men the right to vote, and it was ratified shortly after on February 3rd, 1870. African Americans exercised their right to vote and held office in many Southern states through the 1880s, but in the 1890s, steps were taken back to ensure subsequent white supremacy. In 1896, the Supreme Court decision Plessy versus Ferguson legalized separate but equal facilities for the races.
And then next is the Brown versus Board of Education, and we kind of touched on this topic during class, but basically how it all started was a plaintiff named Oliver Brown. He filed a class action suit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, after his daughter was denied interest into their all-white elementary schools. And so this went through a whole Supreme Court ruling and was considered it was considered a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the amendment, which basically stated that no state can deny any person within jurisdiction of the equal protection of the laws. So essentially, after the term separate but equal was established, it became noted that this separation of schools was not separate but equal because the African American schools were unequal to the white schools. And this had a big effect on the education and personal growth of African American children.
And then next we have 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. made his I Have a Dream speech. This famous speech was delivered on August 28th, 1963, during the March on Washington for Jobs at Freedom at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The speech was a powerful call for racial equality and justice, advocating for an end to racism and segregation in the United States. One fun fact about the MLK speech is the original name of the speech was Normalcy, Never Again, but then MLK delivered his remarkable improvised segment, I Have a Dream, which became a defining moment of the speech and led to its popular title. And then we have 2013, we first saw the Black Lives Matter movement. The phrase Black Lives Matter first gained its prominence as a hashtag on social media platforms following the acquittal of George Zimmerman Trayvon Martin's shooter in 2013. The BLM movement then gained even more popularity on May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd's death became a catalyst for change in the BLM movement.
Okay, and then while we were visiting the museum, we decided to ask one of the employees a few questions to gain a better understanding of this culture.
Definitely one that I think is our slave receipts, because it's a very real, very visceral way for people to see, a real way for them to connect to history, especially since it happened almost 200 years ago. So by seeing something and realizing they put a price on a human being, and sometimes these people aren't very much, they're just a little bit younger than we are, just a little bit older. It's very, it hits you at your core. I'll be honest, I am a museum studies student, and so a lot of times interning in this field is a little difficult. Sometimes it's more you're paid an experience instead of actual money. This one was a paid experience, but coming in, I did start off on that reason, but after being here, I really found a love for it. And the curators have just been wonderful on letting me run my own horizons in terms of museums, and they let me do some fun exhibits and work on tours and things like that. So it's just been a really, really great experience, and now I have a special place in my heart for this museum and the story it tells.
So it was great getting to talk to her, getting to understand a little bit more about why she enjoys working there and what made her start, and then just some information about the exhibits in there. So we also got this information from her, and then just research that I also did. Society's perceptions of African Americans vary widely. It's influenced by historical context, media representations, and systematic inequalities. While progress has been made in challenging stereotypes, significant racial biases still exist and affect African Americans' access to opportunities and social relationships globally. And then when we asked her, her response was that the stories of African Americans are thought of which with much tragedy throughout the years because of being taken from Africa and being sold into slavery in the US. It also includes things such as generational poverty, segregation, and racism.
So next is the connection to education. So as I previously discussed, and as we've discussed in class, the Brown versus Board of Education has a huge role in the history of the connection that African American history has to education. And how it connects to it now is how implicit bias can contribute to disparities in school districts. A lot of things that we talk about in school today have relation to the history that we've learned about previously. And so I think that this topic is really important to discuss in schools.
Okay, so teaching this in our classroom, usually in 5th grade, students start to learn or to take history classes, which is whenever they would be learning about African American history. And for our first strategy, we came up with use a summarized timeline of the events and have students choose one time frame to conduct research on by themselves for a project. And then the second strategy, which would just be like fun, maybe for even younger kids, is to assign students to go home and ask their family members about their own heritage, then present that information that they learned to the class. And from there, you could also teach them like how to respond to other people's culture and go into like the topic of discrimination. Okay, and then so for the 3 principles of me, the first principle we chose states that teachers must teach about the social and historical realities of the American society and the global society and help students gain a better understanding of the causes of oppression and inequality, including racism, ageism, sexism, and classism. As teachers, we must teach about these hard topics to show the importance of not discriminating against others. For example, the African American Museum is full of eye-opening exhibits that were hard for us as 20-year-olds to look at, but they're part of our history and everyone needs to be aware of that history. So it's important that teachers teach because our students are the future and we don't want history to repeat itself. The next principle we chose states multicultural education must start where the people are. And as teachers, we don't know the biases that students are bringing with them to class from their parents or from their peers. So we must teach about what bias is and how some views on topics are not socially acceptable. And yeah, lastly, we chose multicultural education should incorporate multicultural resources from the local community. And I think that the African American Museum was a prime example of something that none of our group members knew we had in College Station until this project, but it was really neat to know. So as teachers, we should encourage our students to find those resources and tell them about those resources so that they can go out in the community and learn about different cultures.
And then, so after reflecting on my experience, I think it was really interesting and eye-opening. I know that one part that really stuck out to me was, like the museum employee has said, was the slave receipts. I think it's one thing to see it and hear about it in school, but it's another thing to see it all in person and then hear the actual stories behind it and see the actual names and pictures. So that was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah, and I basically said the same thing as Taylor. But I feel like whenever we learn about things in history, we often just think, oh, we're studying this for our next test. And in this museum, it was eye-opening to see everything and like, oh wow, this is so much more than just what I memorized in high school. And yeah, it was a great experience.
I did think the same thing as well. Just getting to see the actual things and the real documents and reading about it from their perspective, and then also just like gaining an understanding from talking to people at that museum. Again, it was just really eye-opening and interesting to see how it was then and just even what has changed or what it's like now compared to everything we saw in the museum.
Yeah, I feel like we all like have the same kind of reflection about the experience we had. It was just really highly impactful. And every single exhibit too. I want to point out the slave receipts too, even though we kind of already touched on it. It was just really impactful to just see it before our eyes, and it was a truly eye-opening experience. I'm glad we had to experience this for the project.
Okay, so for questions for you, we have, what did you learn about African American culture that you didn't already know? And based on the slide with the images, which exhibit do you find the most interesting? And next, some of African American history is difficult to hear. How do you teach it to students in a way without making them sad? And lastly, do you agree with how this culture is viewed in society right now? And these are our sources.
And then I would also like to point out something that I found really interesting about the Brazos Valley African American Museum, which is what the museum employee told us. She said that you're able to go and get your family search history for free, which I think is really cool. She was telling us that she was able to find her grandpa's immigration records from when he immigrated from Sweden, and then she was able to go back to before 600 AC, which I think is crazy. So I thought I'd like to point that out just in case if you ever want to visit. I think that's something that you should look into.
Yeah, and while we were there was somebody doing it and it seemed really interesting. So that's our project. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.